Okay, the last part of our Unit 12 exam will have 47 general multiple choice questions. Here's just a sampling to start with. Who are the three big names of abstract expressionism? That's the New York school. One of these three names will be the answer. What was the Bauhaus? Which artist constructed paintings by using tiny strokes of color and relied on the theory of optical mixing? His technique was also called pointillism, a very broad hint. Matisse and his followers were first called the Fauves on the occasion of the... I thought this was a hard question. I had to look it up myself, and in fact, I ended up putting some of these major shows onto your timeline. The sculpture on the left is by Noam Gabo. The tower, a model for the never-built monument to the Third International, by the way, that's going to be another question later on, was designed by Vladimir Tatlin. Russian constructivists set out to express the ideals of the Russian Revolution, and they wanted to help construct or build that revolution. They were not standing aside from it at all. But Stalin hated them, and so the movement died out. So here we have a question about the Mexican muralists. Both artists explore themes of how Mexicans were exploited by conquistadors, by American imperialists, and by their own leaders. So, what kind of issues and themes are those? I don't think you'll find that a hard question. Many late 19th century artists such as Cezanne and Van Gogh were strongly influenced by which of the following? I think you actually got this question on your last test as well, since Impressionists fit in there. But what you see here is on the left, a Japanese woodblock print by the artist Hiroshige, and on the right, Van Gogh's copy of the same print. What were Georgia O'Keeffe's primary subjects? Well, by the way, she also painted New York City street scenes, but her most famous works were taken from, you see a couple of examples here. This fellow collaborated closely with Picasso in exploring the Cubist style. I've included a couple of his works, and I'll drop the further hint that his name begins with a B. Claes Oldenburg. You heard from him on the video, and I hope you looked at the images. What does this art focus on? The answer will be obvious if you remember what these images look like. By the way, you saw similar sculptures in the podcast section on pop art. Which artist introduced the concept of ready-made? Okay, you guys all know who foisted the urinal on the art world, right? Judy, at least. David Smith is known for a series of large metal sculptures called... I've been surprised at how often this artist shows up on AP exams in various forms. His work is distinctive and easy to identify, and this sculpture makes the answer really obvious. Dada. Dadaists were responding to the violent and irrational events of the answer really depends on your keeping the timeline straight. I think one of the ways to keep your date straight is to think in terms of pre-World War I, the years between the two world wars, post-World War II, and then kind of a postmodern coda. Dada was one of the interwar movements. This poster should be a pretty strong hint. Okay, this question shows up in some form on virtually every test. So which art movement borrowed from the theory and practice of psychoanalysis? The question might also read theory and practice of Freud, even possibly the psychologist Jung, who was more influential with the abstract expressionists or New York school of the concept of the collective unconscious, in particular motivated Jackson Pollock. But at any rate, the painting on the bottom right surely gives the answer away. But see if you can identify the other works and artists. These are folks you should know. This is a period that the College Board enjoys asking about. And I was talking about this. Which other art movement was interested in the role of the unconscious and the psychological? You see paintings by each of the big three. And again, remember particularly the theories of Jung and how we all have collective memory, a collective unconscious that we can tap into. And that's what Pollock in particular was trying to do with his paintings. Oh, there's that tower again and what it's commemorating. I gave you that answer before. Why is this showing up again? Well, the College Board seems to ask a question about Russian constructivists on every test. So know who they are. Okay. And you need to know terms for these abstract expressionist painters. I've also given you the term New York School, but they also are given a title that refers to their whole body, if you will, method of creating works. It's usually applied to Jackson Pollock, but also to Willem de Kooning, who painted this work. Okay, you saw this on the architecture review as well. This is the late 19th century Art Nouveau movement related to the arts and crafts movement. What kind of designs does it intend to incorporate? That's particularly clear from the Victor Horta stairwell on the left, but you should also recognize Louis Sullivan's highly decorative design for the bottom of that circular tower in the Carson Peary Scott department store. Okay, the 20th century art movement that incorporated imagery from comic books, advertisements, movies, televisions. You guys surely all recognize pop artist Roy Lichtenstein. Remember those Ben-Day dots? And I'll bet you could name another very famous pop artist if you tried. What was the 20th century movement associated with speed and industry? This is a little bit like Russian constructivism. It seems to be a single question, AP question all the time, although I would not be. Well, I know that at least on one occasion, the work on the left has turned out as an image-based question. It's on your image test. But in general, you need to know this group. The key word is speed, but the question might refer to motion or machine, or maybe, though not on this exam, the so-called cleansing power of war. This was a while ago and we went through it quickly, but this is a group of late 19th century artists. Notice the painting style on the one hand is more representational, but the subject matter is highly fantastical, reflects the inner mind. As a hint, you can find these in your book and you'll see immediately what movement they are. But my hint is that Henri Rousseau was also sometimes thought to fit into this group. We're talking about sort of inner mindscapes. I like Rousseau better than these two, I confess. So Rodin, he worked with all of the following European sculptural forms except, well, what do you see here? You have a nude couple kissing. You have the heroic burghers of Calais, and remember, you want to know their story. And Dante, or probably Dante, sitting at the gates of hell. The answer is going to be a kind of work you don't see. Think Donatello or even the statue of Marcus Aurelius. That's a very broad hint. Louise Nevelson shows up more than I would have expected. This is not an artist I knew very well before preparing for this course. You saw the sculpture on the left on the podcast. The sculpture on the right is another example of her work. But be careful. The correct answer is not wood, even though both of these sculptures are made of woods. What's important is where she gets the wood. So think Rauschenberg or even Dada. The process of creating this kind of sculpture from found pieces is called assemblage. I don't think I used that term in my podcast, so I'm just flat out giving you the answer. Like Spiral Jetty, which of the following is considered a site-specific work? This is going to be the answer. You need to know the artist and the name of the work, and you might recall that not everybody appreciates this fellow's huge-scale installation art, particularly the citizens of Colorado. Another big hint. This may be tougher. You may have to go back and find her. This is an artist who uses photomontages to comment on social issues, an interwar artist and a Dada artist. As always, I recommend paying special attention to female artists. They tend to get a lot of time on the College Board tests. What term did Kasimir Malevich use to refer to the movement represented by his abstract paintings of pure geometric form? By the way, be careful. Although he influenced the constructivists, he was not a constructivist, or at least there's a different term that was used for his work. Here you see Airplane Flying, which is perhaps his most famous work, along with White on White. Okay, Rauschenberg is popular, and particularly this image on the right, but actually both of these images, I believe, have shown up on AP exams before. So he made these works that were a hybrid of painting and sculpture out of found objects. So you have a stuffed goat with a tire around it, for example. And he had a very specific name that he gave this kind of hybrid, and it's a question that shows up pretty frequently on the test. The College Board is also enamored of the Dutch de Stijl movement. You see here Mondrian's geometric paintings. a Gerrit Rietveld chair, and his famous Schroeder house. So what are the key characteristics? And it's an accept question. I think it's actually a little tricky. So let me talk it through a little bit. Are these works symmetric? I think the answer is no. They're balanced, but they're not symmetric. In other words, they are not mirror images of each other. They're balanced but asymmetric. They're highly rectangular. That's true of the painting, of the furniture, and of the house. They employ primary colors. By the way, you have to look kind of closely, but you'll see yellow, red, and blue in tubes on the Schroeder house or in pillars of some sort in the Schroeder house. And of course, it's the red and blue armchair with a little yellow and a typical Mondrian painting. So I've given you all the answers, but the except. I think you'll be able to figure it out from there. So Cubist collages frequently incorporated, and both of these collages incorporated. I'm not, by the way, talking about chair caning or rope, but something else that you see in these collages. Cezanne sought to capture what abiding elements from nature? The contrast with the Impressionists is that basically Impressionists were fascinated by the transitory effects of light. They wanted to capture the moment. Cezanne was much more interested in the basic underlying geometry. And this way, he is kind of a predecessor to the Cubists, who certainly thought they owed a debt to Cezanne. He's interested in underlying shapes and structures. I've already mentioned his name, but which of our artists produced landscapes in a naive style? By the way, for the next few slides, the images basically give you the answer, so I'm not going to say a lot more. Paul Cezanne and Claude Lorraine were both painters famous for their looking basically for a genre of painting, and you should be able to figure that out pretty easily. What historical event did Dorothea Lange document in her photographs? This is not the most famous of these photographs. This one I found on the internet. The most famous one is in your textbook. And by the way, one that you might need to recognize. You might very well be asked to identify the photographer from one of her photographs. So the question is, which of the following was a 20th century expressionist artist? I figured out the answer basically through process of elimination, but I'd realized I hadn't really thought of the Mexican muralists, Rivera and Orozco, as being, or Frida Kahlo for that matter, as being expressionists. But, actually they really are in their use of color, color emotionally, although I think of them as having perhaps a broader social and political message. At any rate, this artist is going to be the answer to that question. Here's one panel from his huge Epic of American Civilization, which is also on page 1027 of your textbook. Many of Rodin's works were originally part of a large project entitled, you just saw this on an earlier slide, that's something you need to know. There's a term given for sculptures that Alexander Calder produced, very distinctive, so you might very well be asked, as you are in the image-based test, to identify one that you hadn't seen before. One name for these is kinetic art, that is art that moves. And the term kinetic, that adjective, is used for art that focuses on movement. But there's another more famous name for these sculptures. They also hang over babies' cribs. Pardon me. Okay, who's this painter? The work on the left is in your book, by the way, and in my PowerPoints, the one on the right is on an early AP test. To give you a few more hints, he is considered a post-painterly, hard-edge abstract painter, also associated with minimalism, very distinctive work, and again, an artist the College Board often seems to ask you to be able to identify. Okay, here's another accept painting. It's a pretty easy one. It's a little hard to tell from the slides, but these works were both quite thickly painted. That technique is called, I might remind you, impasto. Also notice the very bright, vibrant colors, although not necessarily representational colors, not a lot of green faces out there. And finally, note the strong outlines. Impressionist paintings often kind of blur at their edges. That is not true of post-impressionists such as Matisse or Gauguin, or even for that matter, Cezanne. What kind of materials does the minimalist art of Donald Judd use? Well, I could have led you astray here, because in my podcast, I talked about how he used plexiglass, because I found that very interesting. But he also used steel and other metals. And he's often compared to David Smith, who used similar materials. So, the description of the work of Paul Gaugin is going to have a reference that this painting will help you with. Basically, how did he and where did he end up painting Polynesian girls? I don't think you're going to find this a hard question. Who's the photographer? The two photographers that you really need to be able to identify in this unit are Alfred Stieglitz and Dorothea Lange. The Georgia O'Keeffe was a slip because she was in fact Stieglitz's wife. Their photos are very distinctive, and this one is particularly famous. So you need to know the photographer. And you also need to know this painter, and I'm not going to give you the name again since it's an artist you need to know. Everybody knows Dali. I actually personally kind of prefer this particular more abstract surrealist painter. By the way, both he and Dali were Spanish. But I know you didn't finish the Surrealist podcast in class. I hope you are now convinced that the College Board asks a lot of questions about surrealism. Remember, there were a lot of essay questions about surrealism as well. So if you never got around to finishing up that podcast, it might be a good idea to do. If not before the image-based test, then before you take this general multiple choice test. And with that, I close my last unit test review. Now we move on to the real thing.